皆さんこんにちは。最近やテレビを見ていると Z 世代は打たれ弱い、すぐ辞める、根性がない、そんな言葉を見かける機会が以前より増えたように感じます。中には、これからの時代は大丈夫なのか、若い世代は本当に働く気があるのか、そんな不安や疑問を持っている人もいるかもしれません。でも、ここで一度立ち止まって考えてみたいんです。そもそも、Z 世代とは何者なのでしょうか。本当に、ただ無能だとか、我慢が足りないとか、そんな一言で片付けられる世代なのでしょうか。あるいは、時代の変化の中で、これまでとは違う合理性を持って生きている世代、と考えた方が自然なのでしょうか。今回の動画では、Z 世代について語られるときに、よく出てくるイメージを、一旦横に置いて、まずは一般的にどういう世代なのか、そしてなぜ就職観や価値観が、上の世代と違って見えるのか、そこをわかりやすく整理していきます。このシリーズでは、Z 世代を持ち上げることもしませんし、逆に頭ごなしに否定することもしません。大事なのは、好き嫌いではなく、なぜそうなったのかを知ることです。では、見ていきましょう。
First of all, what does the term Generation Z actually mean? These days you hear it everywhere. On the news, on social media, in casual conversation. But if someone suddenly asks, so, what kind of generation are they exactly? A lot of people would probably struggle to explain it clearly. In general, Generation Z usually refers to people born from the late 1990s to around 2010. That is the rough image most people have. But the most important point is not the exact birth years. What really matters is this. What kind of world did this generation grow up thinking was normal? Generation Z grew up with the internet already all around them. Smartphones, social media, video platforms, search engines. These were not exciting new inventions to them. They were simply part of everyday life from the very beginning. In other words, older generations often had to adapt to the digital world. As they got older, but Gen Z is different. They are a generation that has been breathing inside the online world from the start. And that difference is bigger than many people realize. Think about how they gather information. Think about how they build relationships. Think about how they choose jobs. Think about how they react to other people's opinions and criticism. The foundation under all of those things is slightly different from previous generations. So when people look at Gen Z and say, why do they think like that? Or young people were not like this before. In a way, that reaction is understandable, because the world they grew up in is simply different. For example, not so long ago, there was a very clear model of success: get into a good company, stay there for a long time, and slowly move up the ladder. In return for security, people were expected to adapt to the company. Even if things were unfair or frustrating, they were told not to quit easily. That value system was deeply rooted in society. But by the time Gen Z was growing up, that correct path was already starting to crack. Lifetime employment no longer looked guaranteed. Even large companies did not always seem safe forever. People were becoming more aware of burnout, stress, and toxic workplaces. The term black company was no longer unusual. So Gen Z grew up in a world where the old promise, if you give your life to a company, your future will be secure, no longer felt fully believable. That is why, when they look for jobs, many of them focus on more than just a famous company name. They care about questions like, is this place actually comfortable to work in? How are the people there? Can I take time off without guilt? Can I work there without losing myself? Older generations may look at that and say, young people care too much about conditions, or even they are selfish. But from another angle, you could also say, they are simply less willing to treat their own lives carelessly. If staying means breaking down, they would rather leave. If a workplace is draining them, they would rather rethink their path. They tend to make those decisions faster than people did in the past. And social media plays a huge role in that. Young people today are not living inside only one school, one office, or one local community. The moment they open their phones, they can see how people in other companies live. They can watch stories about changing jobs. They can see freelancers, side hustlers, entrepreneurs, and remote workers. Every day, they are exposed to examples of both success and failure. In the past, someone might have thought, this company feels strange, but had no real basis for comparison. They may have simply assumed, well, maybe this is just how work is. But now, other possibilities are visible. Different choices are visible. Different ways of living are visible. That is why Gen Z is not really a generation that simply endures without knowing better. They are more like a generation that knows there are alternatives and chooses again. And that is a major difference. People also often say that Gen Z is highly sensitive to evaluation and criticism. This too is often simplified into comments like, they are mentally weak. They cannot handle being corrected. But the reality is more complicated. We live in a time when reactions are always visible. Likes, views, follower counts, comments, read receipts. Even everyday life can feel like a constant stream of tiny judgments. If you grow up in that kind of environment, It makes sense that you would become more sensitive to evaluation, not less. So when it comes to Gen Z, the issue is not necessarily that they are weak against strictness itself. It is often that they strongly reject criticism that feels meaningless, emotional, or unfair. On the other hand, if the rules are clear, if the explanation makes sense, if the situation feels fair, many of them are more than willing to respond seriously. This is exactly where misunderstandings often happen in the workplace. Older generations sometimes think, well, that is how I was trained too. But many Gen Z workers think, was that harshness really necessary? Do not attack me emotionally, tell me clearly what I should improve. That gap creates tension. To older people, Gen Z may seem difficult to manage. To younger people, older systems may feel painfully outdated. Another common idea is that Gen Z values being true to yourself more than stability. But even that phrase can be misleading. When people hear being yourself, they may imagine someone who only wants to do what they like, or someone who runs away from anything uncomfortable. But in reality, many Gen Z individuals are seriously asking a deeper question. What am I working for in the first place? Yes, salary matters. But money alone is not enough to make them stay. They care about whether the work makes sense to them, whether their life feels balanced, whether the future they are building actually feels worth living. And many of them start thinking about those questions much earlier than people did before. That is not just idealism. It may actually be a form of realism shaped by uncertainty. Because when the future feels unstable, simply enduring without questioning anything no longer feels like the obvious right answer. So maybe Gen Z is not a dreamy generation. Maybe they are a generation trying to find their own sense of meaning in an unstable world. Of course, none of this applies perfectly to everyone. There are plenty of Gen Z people who work hard and stay loyal to one company. And there are plenty of older people who understand flexible, modern ways of living and working. That is why generational labels are useful, but also dangerous. They can help us notice patterns, but they can also become unfair and overly simplistic. So the important thing is not to say Gen Z is like this, as if every person fits the same mold. What matters more is understanding why these values emerged in the first place. When times change, what feels normal also changes. Common sense changes. Reasons for working change. What people want from a company changes. If we ignore that and judge the present only by old standards, then younger people start to look like a mystery. But once you look at the background, it becomes clear that words like lazy or lacking grit do not explain very much at all. Generation Z grew up in an era overloaded with information, an era with more visible choices but also more instability, and they are trying to find their own version of a meaningful life inside that uncertainty. That is why their ideas about jobs are different. That is why their attitudes toward work are different. That is why their priorities in life may look different too. The real question is this: do we call that weakness? Or do we call it adaptation to a new era? That difference in perspective matters a lot.